Hi guys, and welcome to another session of Under the Hood of. Today we're going to be taking a look under the hood of test runners, more specifically focusing on Mocha. So the talk today will be focusing on building our own test runner, starting with an introduction, then looking at the nuts and bolts. The bulk will be the execution phase of this. So before we move on, here is some of the basic terminology for the core functionality of any test runner. You've got your test, which is functions with an assertion inside, suite, which is a collection of the tests, a hook, which are functions run at specific times in a test runner's lifecycle. There's the reporter, which determines the presentation of the output, the interface, which is the methods that will be used inside of each test. For example, there's describe and it, which is also known as the UI. And then lastly is the runner, which is a given run of the suite, test, hooks, reporter, etc. And this uses an instance of a runnable, which we'll take a look at later. So part A, introduction to our test runner. So given that test runners can include a huge variation of functionality, not all of which is necessary for the basic job of the test runner. Today we're going to be building our own test runner, which includes tests, suites, hooks, interfaces, and reporters. This means we'll be ignoring any other features, for example, option validation, timeout management, slow test flagging, pending states, all those kind of extra features. We're just going to be looking at a core mechanics of getting a test runner to work with passes and failures and hooks. On the right side, you can see the output from our runner. It's going to include one test failing. There's going to be two tests in different suites passing, and the second suite is going to be logging all of the hooks. So you can see we're going to have a before all, a before each, an after each, and an after all. So that's what we're going to be working on today. So it's necessary to understand the types of modules that can be used in and are found in the Mocha.js codebase. As we will be sticking to the same, it will explain some of the code conventions that you'll see within Mocha. Mocha uses CJS modules inside of core, so it does not support ESM natively yet. However, Mocha accepts ESM for test files. So for your test file, you can use the import and export syntax, but for the core of Mocha, it still uses require and exports. It's also worth noting that Mocha does not have a transpilation step yet, but there are plans at work to add this. So most of the code is ES5. So our runner's basic breakdown. There are going to be three parts to our runner. Part one, the entities required for a test runner. These include everything from that we mentioned previously, so tests, hooks, suites, reporters, interfaces, runnable, and a runner. Number two is the parsing phase. It's the first of two steps for the runner. The goal with this phase is to build a coherent CLI for the user. So we want a CLI that is intuitive to a user. Mocha.js actually makes use of YArgs. You can see the starting point in the Mocha codebase under lib CLI.js, and it uses ES5 prototype chain for its class instances. And then the final part is the execution phase. This relies on the Mocha instance to be handed to it from the parsing phase. And this part creates an instance of a runnable and execute everything from the suites, tests to the hooks and reporters. So the execution phase is where the bulk of our work actually happens. It's very important. So now it's time to dive into our test runner. Starting with the parsing phase, all the code can be found in the repository, which is linked at the end and in the video description. So here we can create our YArgs instance. It includes the basics required to have an intuitive command line interface. So for instance, here we're asking for version information, asking for help. We attach a commands object, which we'll go into in the next slide. I've included comments. In the comments, I've included the location of the code in the real Mocha codebase. So if you're interested in pausing, going and have a look at where this is in the Mocha codebase, feel free. This is the commands object. So this details how we're going to use our child YArgs instance. It will set options and run validation checks. So you can see the options method and the checks method, which you can read some of the comments in there to understand more about what's Mocha actually doing there. As I said before, we are ignoring a lot of that, the checks for now. And then finally, it passes all of these, and it will build a new Mocha instance. We can see the new Mocha. And hand it to the next phase. So you can see the run Mocha, and there we're handing our instance of Mocha. So building the Mocha instance. So let's have a look at what creating a Mocha instance does by examining its constructor, plus a couple of the UI and the reporter instance methods. So here we can see the constructor, which creates an instance of our root suite and attaches to this .suite, as you can see. The suite actually inherits the publisher subscriber architecture from the event emitter, which is actually found quite a lot through the Mocha codebase. The UI method is based on the interface. We are going to be binding events which attach interface methods onto our suite context under this .suite. So on the next slide, we'll take a look at the details of the bind interface. And then the reporter method creates an instance of a reporter and attaches it to this underscore reporter. An example of the reporter is the spec function, and we'll be coming to that in a moment. So how does the interface work with our Mocha instance? So this is the BDD interface that we spoke about. So our BDD interface, it's called from the UI method, which is called from the constructor on the previous slide. So let's walk through what's going on. So each time the event is fired, inside the execution phase, which is coming later, the listener callback runs. The callback is given the params, context, file, and our Mocha instance. So based on the event, so here's the event file pre-require, it attaches the interface methods, and you can see the context.after equals, context.describe equals, context.it equals, many of which come from a utility object called common. And then here the describe method creates a new suite via the suite.create, and the it method creates a new test via the new test, as you can see there. So that's it for the parsing phase. We now have our Mocha instance, which is the reporter and the suite with the interface getting attached each time. So now on to the last step, the execution phase. Now we have everything that we need to execute our test runner. We'll be loading files and then running it. There's quite a lot of code here. So our parser calls run Mocha inside the handler in the parsing phase earlier. So we'll now look at the run Mocha. So it starts by building an array of all the files to be run. We pass them from the spec array. So this is the thing that actually contains all of the spec files that we're going to be running. This is all coming from the validation and the checks. That's where they were built. So we have a very simplified version of this, but in the real Mocha codebase, there are many checks done against the spec items to check for globs, files, directories, etc. Next, we call the load files async. This loads the ESM and the CJS files asynchronously. It emits the event pre-require event and then runs the root suite. The event file pre-require event had the listen set in our BDD interface earlier. Remember the slide earlier? So there's our event file pre-require. So it is now that the interface methods are added to the context suite. So now they're added. In the Mocha codebase, it's under ESM utils.js. And then the final step of this, as you can see, is that we're going to run the mocha.run method, which moves us onto the running step. So, onto the running step. This phase is split into the following sections. We're going to be looking at the mocha.run method, the reporters, a bit more in detail, the runner.run, and then an in-depth look at the code for the runner.run. And then actually, if you can always skip that and just take a look at the running step summary, because there's quite a lot of code in that in-depth look. So let's move on. Mocha.run. So let's walk through what it does. Focusing on the left here, we're going to create an instance of a runner and add the stats collecting. Similarly to the suite, the runner inherits from the event emitter, which is a Node.js available module. This is for the this is for the publish and subscribe events functionality that Mocha relies on. On the right is our stats collector method. On pass, fail, end events is going to increment the pass, fail, and end event on the runner.stats object, as you can see. You can see we're adding a stats and adding it to the runner.stats. In the real Mocha codebase, it's found on the lib stats collector. Now back to our mocha.prototype.run. Next, we create an instance of a reporter using the runner. You can see we're doing a new reporter, handing it the runner. So now let's take a quick side look at what's going on within the actual reporters themselves. We're going to take a look at the spec and the base. So inside the reporter, we add spec-specific listeners onto the runner events. For example, on an event run end event, we will run the reports.epilogue, and this is just for the spec. See here for a snippet from the spec reporter, which includes events for the run begin. We've got the test pass. We've got event test fail, and we've got event event run end, so the run end. So essentially, as the runner is running our tests, the spec reporter is printing output. On the right is the epilogue from the base reporter. It processes the details on the stats on the this.stats, and once the tests are finished, outputs a final statement detailing a summary of the run. So that's the spec reporter is kind of doing things on the fly as it's going on the base reporter. The epilogue is there as a summary at the end. So finally, our mocha.run triggers runner.run. If I go back, runner.run at the bottom there, and now we can move on to take a bit more of a bigger look at the runner.run. So let's walk through runner.run. It's going to creates a listener for the event run end events. It will run the FN callback with failure details. It emits an event run begin event. Then it executes each suite on the root suite via run suite. This is very important because essentially for each suite it's going to run all the tests and hooks. And once that is finished, it emits an event run end event. So not that crazy, but now we're going to dig deeper into the run suite that is being run there. So runner.run suite summary. So this is where all the suite, as mentioned, this is where all the suite, the tests and the hooks are executed. To summarize how it works, starting with the root suite, it executes all the before hooks for the suite, number 1. Number 2, then runs all the tests for the suite. Number 3, then runs all the after hooks for the suite. Then number 4 moves on to the next suite. The next section looks at the code necessary to run this. Alternatively, you can skip to the summary section after this to see a bit more of an overview. So, an in-depth look at the code for runner.run. We're going to be taking a look at 5 methods. The total size of all the code required is quite large, so in an attempt to make it easier to follow the mechanics here, I've included most of the required code for them to understand exactly what is necessary for it to run a basic test runner. The runner methods we were going to cover are run suite, hook, run tests, run test, and then hooks. And I'll explain each one as we go along. So runner.run suite, it emits an event suite begin event, then it triggers the before all hooks with a callback. So let's look at the callback, the hook callback for the after the before all. It's going to trigger the run tests, handing suite and the next callback. Now we'll look at the next callback. Grab the next suite in the suites array. If no suite is left, we're going to trigger done. Else we call itself via run suite with the next suite. So you can see that inside of the next function there. And now we'll just take a look at the done callback as well. So inside the done callback, we run all the after all hooks, and then we emit an event suite end event. So that will signify that the run has finished. So that's run suite. The next is runner.hook. So we grab all the hooks with the given name. It's very specific. It's very important that it's based on the name. Trigger the next callback with the hook index. So now we can look at the next callback. Using the index, grab the current hook. If there's no hook, call fn, call our callback. Else set the test context, and then lastly execute the hook. And that's the hook.run, and then we run that with a callback, as you can see. So that hook.run method, this comes from the runnable.run method, shown on the right, you can see, as the hooks inherit from the runnable. And all it does is it calls the function with the calls this function with the current context. Now finally we can look at the run callback, as in where point number 6 is. We're going to increment the hook index and call it again, which will trigger the next hook under the given name. So runner.run tests. This is going to trigger the next callback. You can see at the bottom there. So our next callback. Grab the next test. If no tests are left, we're going to trigger the callback. Else we run the before each hooks. Now we're going to look at the hooks callback. The callback inside of the hooks function. Trigger the run test. And now for the run test callback. If there is a test failure, we're going to emit the event test fail event. Else, you can see we emit the event test pass event. For both branches, we're going to emit the event test end event and run the after each hook. And the runner.run test, there's an early return if there's no test available. Run the test via test.run, so it's actually going to run the test, and handle any test errors. And there's a couple of different ways that's processed within the Mocha codebase. So runner.hooks, it calls the next callback. So let's take a look at the next callback, the next function. If there are no sweets left to run, trigger the callback, trigger the hook for the given name, and after that, run the hooks for the next sweet. Right, so I know that was a lot kind of going on there. So the core flow involved in the runner that we've just mentioned is, so for the runner, it attaches the event listeners, updates the stats property, and then triggers the root sweet. Then the sweet executes the before all hooks, begins its execution of the tests, executes the after all hooks, and executes the next sweet. The tests execute the before each hook, executes the tests, emits the test, pass, fail, and end events, handles any unexpected failures, and executes the after each hooks. The hooks execute all the hooks under the given name, that's their job. And then finally the reporter attaches event listeners, processes the stats, and logs output to the terminal or the browser, depending on the type of reporter. So there you have it, the Mocha test runner broken down from the parsing to the execution. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful, or at least interesting in some ways. You can find the repository for all of this code in this link, which is under my GitHub, under our own Mocha. Subscribe to my YouTube for more Under the Hood ofs coming soon. Thanks very much.